After America is made on the lands of the Bunurong and Wurundjeri Woiwurrung peoples of the Kulin Nations. We pay our respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded.
We are in a battle for the soul of America.
This is a fraud on the American public.
Hi, I'm Emma Shortis and this is After America. The Trump administration may have killed what remained of the post-war international order, but last week, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney delivered its eulogy. Speaking at the World Economic Forum in Davos, he said it always was a partial fiction.
The system's power comes not from its truth, but from everyone's willingness to perform as if it were true. We knew the story of the international rules-based order was partially false, that the strongest would exempt themselves when convenient, that trade rules were enforced asymmetrically. And we knew that international law applied with varying rigor depending on the identity of the accused or the victim.
But that system, from which Canada and Australia have benefited, no longer exists.
This fiction was useful, and American hegemony in particular helped provide public goods, open sea lanes, a stable financial system, collective security, and support for frameworks for resolving disputes. So we placed the sign in the window. We participated in the rituals, and we largely avoided calling out the gaps between rhetoric and reality. This bargain no longer works. Let me be direct. We are in the midst of a rupture, not a transition.
Carney's speech was striking because he put that so clearly. And he reminded his peers that the world that emerges out of this rupture doesn't have to be shaped by Donald Trump alone.
Great powers can afford for now to go it alone. They have the market size, the military capacity, and the leverage to dictate terms. Middle powers do not. But when we only negotiate bilaterally with a hegemon, we negotiate from weakness. We accept what's offered. We compete with each other to be the most accommodating. This is not sovereignty. It's the performance of sovereignty while accepting subordination. In a world of great power rivalry, the countries in between have a choice. Compete with each other for favor, or to combine to create a third path with impact. We shouldn't allow the rise of hard power to blind us to the fact that the power of legitimacy, integrity, and rules will remain strong if we choose to wield them together.
This week, we're joined by our friend Allan Behm, advisor in international and security affairs at the Australia Institute, to talk about what happens next.
It was an outstanding speech, riveting, I think, from beginning to end, because I think that apart from little forays into the same field by Emmanuel Macron, Carney is the first one to talk truth to power. And he did it in unembroidered terms, but they were pretty direct and quite forceful, and I think brought to the attention of everybody in the so-called free world, but particularly the allies of the United States, exactly the position that we're all in at the moment. And I think that he deserves great credit for that, because the rest of the allies have steered clear of doing anything that could be seen to irritate President Trump. And my judgment is confirmed on that point with the immediacy of Trump's response. Mm-hmm. You know, Mark had better learn manners if he's going to talk to me next time. Well, if I were Trump, I'd get ready for even more of it. I think Carney is on a winner here. And I think politically within Canada, but also, again, more broadly within the NATO group, Carney is emerging as the leader of the NATO group. And that's an extraordinary thing for a Canadian to be able to achieve.
Mm. Do you think it matters then that it was Carney in particular? I think that's what you're getting at, but, you know, it's not the first time that somebody has said this, that, you know, the international rules-based order was imperfect, but we all play the game because it suited us and, you know, for the most part for America's allies, it didn't go too far. Is that why this feels like such a big moment, because Carney occupies that position that you were outlining?
Look, I think so. I think that is the reason for it. As I touched upon earlier, there are not many who could do this Canada as not only the next door neighbour of the United States, but as the other member of NATO that has been identified by Trump particularly for annexation, I think that that puts the Prime Minister of Canada in a pretty unique position to be able to speak about what that kind of threat actually means, both for Canada and for NATO. So in a way, it would have been a terrible pity if he hadn't done it, because he's the best placed player to be able to do it. I think Keir Starmer is nowhere near being able to do that for reasons that we might touch upon a bit later, Emma, and that is that in many respects, Britain, in its embrace of the United States, is in a position very similar to Australia's. Canada's is somewhat different for technical reasons, and again, within the NATO grouping, I think is an absolutely credible pretender to the leadership of NATO.
We know the old order is not coming back. We shouldn't mourn it. Nostalgia is not a strategy. But we believe that from the fracture, we can build something bigger, better, stronger, more just. This is the task of the middle powers. The countries that have the most to lose from a world of fortresses and a most to gain from genuine cooperation. The powerful have their power. But we have something too. The capacity to stop pretending, to name reality, to build our strength at home, and to act together. That is Canada's path. We choose it openly and confidently, and it is a path wide open to any country willing to take it with us.
Yeah, I mean, that certainly seems to be the way that Carney is positioning Canada. Let's talk now about, I guess, the substance of the speech and how Carney is envisioning doing that, because he kind of got at how difficult diplomacy and alliance building will be for the United States' former allies, and spoke about building different coalitions for different issues based on shared interests or common values, as he described them. Given what the Trump administration is doing, Carney put that in a very straightforward way, but actually doing that isn't particularly straightforward, is it?
No, it's a giant task, actually. And in a way, Carney's policy development remains a work in progress, because his language at this point is still pretty imprecise. I mean, there's plenty of room in what he's said for interpretation. And at one level, that's a good thing in diplomacy. But at another level, it allows people to make of it what they will. And that then can create difficulty down the track. I think it's particularly the case where he talks about interests and values.
To help solve global problems, we're pursuing variable geometry. In other words, different coalitions for different issues based on common values and interests.
Because very often interests and values are posed as a kind of binary. You know, and you and I have said many times that we start talking about values when we've got nothing to talk about. Because the fact is, very few of the NATO countries share values with the President of the United States. Australia doesn't share values with a country that still has execution on its statute books in, 34 of the states, and where I think in about the same number of states, an 11-year-old girl can get married. I mean, these are pretty strange things. So whenever we talk about sharing values with the United States, we need to be very, very much more careful. But alliances actually are not about values. Ultimately, alliances are about shared interests, because interests last and over time values change. Now, those interests are still there, but alliances go beyond interests. They go to the very heart of trust, because the way alliances work is the members of the alliance need to be able to trust each other and trust the putative leader of that alliance. And what we've seen over the last year, certainly the second Trump presidency in particular, we've seen the United States forfeit the trust of its allies. Now, that is serious because it forfeits the alliances as well.
Mm. I mean, Alan, that's very strong language. And I think certainly going into this meeting at Davos, there was a sense that NATO was teetering on the brink. And some analysis I've seen, I mean, it's almost kind of breathing a sigh of relief in that Trump said, or apparently said that, they won't use force to acquire Greenland. And so there's this sense that NATO survives. But it doesn't sound like that's what you think.
No, because the trust has been broken.
Mm.
I mean, how are they going to get trust back in there? Trump vacillates. He changes his mind all the time. He's mercurial. He's impetuous. Who's to say that next time he has a rush of blood to the head, he doesn't reconsider his position and do something quite physical with respect to Greenland? You can't posture like that without there being consequences. And either his partners will say, well, he's just mad, would the United States Congress please get rid of him and impeach him, because they can under the Constitution do that. Or if he's not deemed to be mad, then in some way he must intend what he's saying, that the security of the United States is dependent still on its ownership of Greenland. So annexation has to be sitting somewhere in the back of his mind. But as I say, what has disappeared is the grounds for trust. It's not so much that Greenland has been occupied by American divisions. It is that the trust that drives alliances, the trust in the office of the President of the United States, cannot exist any longer while the power of the President remains untrammeled.
And that's where the rupture, I guess, that Carney was speaking about is. That's where the rupture stems from. And Carney was pressed on this a bit in the Q&A after his speech because, of course, the almost reflexive response to that, if the United States is no longer playing the role that it used to play, then what are the alternatives? What are the alternatives? We always get this, especially in the context of Australia. So, of course, Carney was pressed on Canada's relationship with China.
Also, a big theme of your speech was the need for middle powers to work together. Yeah. But you've just been to the other great power, to China. And I think people are very intrigued by seeing that meeting. And some people say, kind of, that's a mistake, really, because you're going to make yourself more dependent on China. They're not that benign either. The US will be very annoyed. What's the defense of what you're doing, and what do you hope to get out of it?
There are very clear guardrails in that relationship. I spoke of calibration of relationships in my remarks. That's what I mean by it. But within those clear guardrails are huge opportunities. You need a web of connections. And to miss out in that web some of the largest ones, United States, we already have that, China, India, Mercosur, European Union, that's a mistake.
What did you make of Carney's response and his broader, I guess, characterization of Canada's relationship with China in his speech?
Look, I thought that the way in which Carney addressed that really does demonstrate the benefit of being a serious international banker, because he was really looking at the nature of national power in terms of the strength of the economy. And his treatment of national power during his speech, I think, was classical Morgenthau, actually, that he touched upon a good number of the elements of national power, which are in Book 1 of Politics Among Nations. And I think it's a salutary thing that he's reminded everybody that economic strength, a very strong resource base, a formidable education system, a great capacity for organisation, for diplomacy, which, as Morgenthau said, diplomacy is the glue that holds all of the elements of national power together. I thought that what Carney had to say was, really spot on. I couldn't fault that in any way because, you see, with your economic strength comes your ability to manage your security interests. It costs money. And if you haven't got money, you can't do it. And this is where Australia and Canada are in a very similar sort of position. We're really well endowed. We have pretty cohesive populations. We're pretty resilient. We're pretty unified. We have a fabulous standard of living. And when we want to, we can throw money at whatever we want to throw it at. Witness the gifts under the Australian military aid program to Britain and the United States so that they can build their ships for themselves. I mean, we're fabulously rich to be able to do that.
And so generous.
It's a great line. Open your wallet and say after me, help yourself.
I, of course, want to come back to Australia because, naturally we're thinking about what all of this means to Australia. But before we do, Carney, I think you explained it incredibly well there. Carney was effectively saying that countries like Canada do have power. They do have agency, as you have been saying for a long time. And the shape of the world to come out of this rupture, we don't have to just leave it up to Donald Trump. We do have an ability to shape this new world and make it a safer place for everybody. Now, of course, Donald Trump, on his way to Davos, watched this speech and responded, almost exactly as we would expect him to. What did you make of Trump's response?
Well, look, Trump is famous for his short attention span. So I wonder how much of the speech he actually heard and how much he sort of took aboard.
Yeah.
Because I thought his response was petulant. And Carney's speech, whatever else one might say about it, it wasn't provocative. What it was taking truth to power, that he's the first one of the friends, quote unquote, of the United States to take to the president the consequences of the president's actions. And he made it crystal clear, and Trump did not like that. Because he's been able to get away with bluster and bullying, including with us. And we've said nothing about anything. And the best we could do with the effective invasion of Caracas and the abduction of the president of Venezuela was send the world a get well card saying, we hope it all ends nicely.
Yeah.
Well, I wonder how well it can end just in Venezuela. And the countries of the free world who are united around principles of law, I think, have a responsibility to call it out. And that's what Carney has done. And to that extent, I think he's done Donald Trump a great favour.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that's what led Trump at Davos to walk back from the invasion of Greenland. But he's also done the rest of the nervous Nellies, and that includes us, another great favour by calling it out in a way that we don't have to say anything except nod our heads and agree.
Okay, well, let's then, I suppose, get to Australia because, of course, this, as you say, this is an opportunity for the Australian government, but maybe I'm too cynical, but I suspect they won't take this opportunity to pursue those common interests and values with Canada and with like-minded allies, but will continue down the path of, as they did with Venezuela, monitoring, quote unquote, monitoring developments and so forth. Do you think the Australian government has it in it to take this opportunity?
Well, the indicators are not all that exciting, are they?
You're such a diplomat, Allan.
To date, we've said nothing about anything that matters. We're proud of keeping our powder dry, but you have to wonder whether we've got any powder at all, because these things do matter to us. An international rules-based order that we love to talk about all the time, we're not investing in it because one of the investments that you have to make is to make sure that you are advocating the rules. Carney said something in his speech. He quoted from Thucydides, and at the end of Thucydides' history, Thucydides does say that it is for the powerful to do what they want and for the weak to endure what they must. There was a measure of truth in that in Thucydides' time, but it's not true now for the one simple reason that in the last 2,500 years, we've discovered law. L-A-W, law, as Paul Keating once said. The power of law is to regulate the relationship between the strong and the weak, as well as regulating the relationship between the strong and the relationships between those who are not so strong. And by having law, we're then all able to develop societies where our people enjoy basic standards, we hope, of well-being, that people can be happy, as the US Constitution thinks that they should be, and that people are able to live in harmony and build prosperity rather than spending all of their time feeding the engines of war. Mm. And we've got to understand what's happened over that period of history and make the most of the fact that we are able to express those arrangements through agreements and through law. And we should also remember, I think, Emma, that the journey to that position has been hard and there's been a lot of suffering to get there. And so when Doc Evatt and Stettinius and the others were negotiating and drafting the UN Charter, and particularly its preamble in San Francisco in 1945, they understood, I think much better than we do now, the significance of that statement in the preamble about the value and dignity of people, essentially by virtue of our shared humanity, because that is the foundation of the international rule of law. That is a massive development beyond the age of Thucydides. And that's the one that countries like Australia, which like to talk about good international citizenship, to use Gareth Evans' expression, or constructive internationalism, to use Penny Wong's expression, if that's what we're going to talk about, then that is what we've got to do. And we're not doing it. And yet in doing that, I think we would build for ourselves enormous credibility in the same way as Evatt built credibility for us back at the very, the war hadn't actually ended when that was negotiated, but Evatt did a fantastic job doing that. We are the inheritors of that and we should make the most of it. It's an interesting thing, Emma. I've been talking to some of my local diplomatic representatives from the ASEAN countries in the last few days, and they're all interested in whether Australia is going to do anything, and if it is going to do something, what it's going to do. And they're sort of waiting to see whether we're prepared at all to stand up for what we trumpet all the time as being part of our international policy DNA, diplomacy, human rights, the rule of law, international legal systems, the strength of the WTO, how all of these mechanisms operate, the UN, whether the UN is something in which we're going to invest. So Carney's speech at Davos, I think, curiously should encourage our government to pick up the threads and to start elaborating, or if I'm going to use threads, perhaps embroidering the remarks that Carney made, not just to our benefit, and I think it would be enormously to our benefit, but to the benefit of our region, where we do have good neighbours, and to the benefit, I would hope, of the other constructive and progressive members of the UN. And so in the way, and this is really to answer the beginning of your question, the way in which Carney dealt with China, I think, was textbook, because he recognised that China is the driving force of the 21st century economy, and that both Canada and Australia and any number of other countries, Japan, South Korea, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, all of them are riding on the back of China's growth. And while China is growing, while it's investing, we're growing too, we're becoming richer, and that enables us to afford our security. And that's the link, I think, that Carney really does understand, that China is not a threat to Canada's security. Properly constructed agreements, enforceable agreements with China, are actually contributions to Canada's long-term security. I think we've got to see the same sort of logic operating in our case.
And certainly, I mean, it seems that there is the political space to do that. You know, I think part of the reason that Carney's speech was so powerful was because it articulated what so many people think so clearly, which is that they don't want to live in Stephen Miller and Donald Trump's world of violence and power and might makes right. They want to live in a world where, for the most part, people live by the rules because there is an understanding that that contributes to our security and our safety. And as you say, they don't want to spend their time feeding the engines of war. They want to spend their time in the pursuit of happiness. And that is a legitimate thing to aspire to, and having ambition for that is a positive thing. And that's why Carney's speech was so refreshing. But let's get to the role Australia could play in that, because I think you've outlined the broad kind of brushstrokes of that, but you also mentioned earlier that Australia, along with the United Kingdom, occupies a slightly different place to Canada in in the nature of our relationship with the United States. So I guess I wanted to follow up on that and ask you, what room Australia does have to move in that, assuming that, the government does make the choice to move.
Emma, this is a very, very complex question, and I think that what the best we can do at the moment is just touch upon what the nature of the issue is. I don't think it's a problem, by the way. I think it's an issue, and why it is that Australia and Britain have a very particular role to play in the way in which the United States exercises its global power. Yes, we have a Five Eyes agreement, which involves Canada and New Zealand, along with the US, Britain and Australia. But the nodal points, the pivot points of that Five Eyes agreement rests with only three of those countries, and that's the United States, Britain and Australia, because there are three parts of the world which are at this point essential to the way in which the United States exercises its intelligence and its military roles globally. And that's Menwith Hill, which is a facility in Britain. It's a RAF Air Force base, which has got a whole lot of radomes on it that make it look rather similar to Pine Gap. Pine Gap in Australia, which is out in the centre of Australia for issues relating to the physics of our ability to handle the physics of the 1950s, and a couple of sites in the United States, but from our point of view, Buckley Air Force Base in Colorado. So those three facilities are really critical to the United States, and for that reason, Britain and Australia are locked into an embrace with the United States, which is pretty difficult to escape. And that's if we wanted to escape it. But we've got to consider the nature of that embrace with the United States and the extent to which it continues to serve our interests as well as those of the United States at a time when the issue of trust is so unclear. And I think it's a real thing to think about. I don't have a solution to it, Emma, but I think where I'd start looking for one is not to renegotiate the ANZUS Treaty, essentially because there's not much really to renegotiate in that. The operative articles of the ANZUS Treaty commit us to no more than having a chat.
Well, and I mean, in his speech just this week, Donald Trump has made clear that he doesn't even feel the obligation to do that. So much of the mythology around the alliance is that the United States will come to save us if we ever need them. And Trump quite literally said, in Switzerland, if we don't own it, why would we defend it? Nobody cares about something that they don't own.
Yeah, that's right. And he's made it perfectly clear, but many of us have known that for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we've actually read the treaty, which is a pretty big start. And, apart from having a chat, which is what it really requires, any agreements that we enter into would have to be in accordance with our national laws, and we'd have to report them to the UN Security Council. Well, the US doesn't report all that much to the UN Security Council anymore. Pretty hard to see that bit would operate. But the real point is that whether it's NATO, which does have an obligation to act in the mutual interest, slightly more clear than the obligation under ANZUS, or the ANZUS Treaty, which is about having a conversation, That's the limits. But under those treaties, there are dozens and dozens of agreements which lock us in to doing things and doing things that are actually pretty significant. And I think we would want to review those many agreements very carefully to make sure that we have enough latitude to make decisions in our own interests, as well as making decisions in the interests of the United States. It would require, I think, some very careful analysis of those agreements, and I'd include AUKUS in that, to ensure that it's beyond the exercise of sovereignty, which is the exercise of our decision-making, that we truly do have decision rights in those things that we would need to be able to answer if our electorate or our friends elsewhere in the world were to ask us difficult questions. And at this point, I don't think we could answer those questions.
No, I don't think so either. And I don't necessarily think it's because they're difficult questions, which of course they are, but because of an unwillingness to really be brave enough to even begin to ask them. But I suppose on that note, Allan, I am very glad that you at least feel obliged to have a chat with me. I'm always grateful for your time and your generosity. Thank you, as always, for coming on the show.
Oh, thank you very much, Emma.
Thanks so much for joining us for this week's episode. You can save $5 off our latest book, A Time for Bravery, What Happens When Australia Chooses Courage, with the code POD5. That's POD5. The discount is available for a limited time only. And if you'd like to read more about Australia's role in all of this, you can also find my Vantage Point essay, After America, Australia and the New World Order, on the Australia Institute website. It's linked in the show notes. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the show. You can reach us via our email address, which is podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au. This episode was recorded on Thursday, the 22nd of January, Australian time. After America is supported by the Andrew Farron Foundation and produced by Angus Blackman. We'll be back next week. I'm Emma Shortis. Thanks for listening.